Welcome to this COES interview of Brendan Burchell, who is a social scientist at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Sociology. He's also a fellow of Magdalen College, and his research interests focus on the quality of employment and its relationship with the well-being of workers. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that, and also a little bit about the impact that future technology and artificial intelligence can have on job quality and on the labour market as a whole in the United Kingdom and beyond. So welcome to Chile, Brendan.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. So my first question relates a little bit to the background of this subject. The quality of employment has become an increasing concern both in the EU, in the European Union, and also with the International Labour Organization. It's been on the agenda since 1999 when the ILO launched its concept decent work. How much progress have we made since then on the subject?
Some of us have made lots of progress. I think it is an inherently complex thing. It's difficult to think about and what we mean, and lots of people have been thinking about particular parts of people's jobs, just the hours they work or safety at work, but thinking of it in a more global and holistic sense has taken several decades to really know what we're talking about, be talking about the same thing, and talking about it in a way that means it is policy relevant and can be actioned, so we actually know when we make changes.
And how do you see this process as having developed in recent years? Is this issue on the agenda of governments, of policymakers? Have they implemented policies that change or improve the quality of employment?
I think we have seen successes, and there's no doubt about it. If you look over the longer term, say the 100 years period, work is much better now than it used to be. Lots of people used to get killed by their jobs, and now, thankfully, that's relatively rare. The hours we work are much better now. In terms of the more recent focus, there's been lots of false starts, people measuring the wrong things. I mean, for a long time, there was a huge amount of effort went into measuring job satisfaction, which we now know bears little relationship to job quality and really isn't amenable to policy action to the basis of that. But we have got some very good theoretical models of what we should be measuring, how we should be thinking about it, and some very practical examples of how we can measure it and know which countries are doing better, what is best practice, and when there are improvements, we can actually quantify those.
I was recently asked here in Chile a question with regard to the relationship between labour markets as a market and job quality. Basically, people saying, well, isn't this an issue that would just resolve itself as labour markets become tighter, as countries become more developed? Don't jobs just automatically get better? Is that something you would agree with, or do you think that there's a significant role here for regulation?
You can think of, in some labour markets at some points where they operate an efficient market, and in order to be able to recruit the best employees, employers have to improve the quality of their jobs and make that clear to employees. But most of the time that doesn't work, and for all sorts of reasons, that people don't have much choice over the different aspects of their jobs, and it's very difficult before you actually take a job to know what the quality of the job is. You might know about the salary of the job, but all those other things, what is like the social environment of work, the norms in the workplace, you don't know. So no, it doesn't operate as a market 99% of the time, and I think the great success stories we've seen have been about regulation or about trade unions. Again, historically there's different things happening at different points in time. But no, definitely we can't leave it. It's not one of those things we can say the market will sort it out.
What has been the role of trade unions in this process, not just in the UK but also in Europe?
If you look historically over the 20th century, when trade unions in many European countries were very powerful and really could hold employers to account, you did see huge improvements in things like reducing fatalities at work, really important things. Those processes aren't going on anymore. The world has changed, the nature of trade union power has changed, the employment relationship has changed. I don't think we're going to see that, not in many countries. There are still some countries where trade unions are really thinking broadly about job quality, and that's why whenever we do these surveys, we always see Scandinavian countries coming out as having better quality jobs, not just in terms of pay, but in terms of all sorts of other things. And that is because the trade unions there have been negotiating on those things and thinking in a very productive, cooperative way about how to bring about those changes. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to have spread around the world.
And looking to the other side of the equation to employers, I would imagine that there's a significant relationship between job quality and productivity also. How has that played out in practice?
I don't think we really know in enough to generalise on a big... You can point to situations where increased job quality brought about increased productivity. You can also point to the opposite, where... And lots of people make inferences that, for instance, say there's a trade-off between work intensity and productivity. If people are working harder, they're obviously more productive. But actually, there's not much evidence around that. And often when you try and speed things up, people just make more mistakes and become less productive. So productivity is obviously important, and job quality is important in its own right. But the relationship between those two, I think, is quite a complex one. But again, it depends how you define job quality. Some definitions, like the ILO, they define productivity as part of job quality. I think when we talk about job quality, we should be talking about job quality focused on the employee, and what employers want from it, productivity, is another separate thing. And again, part of that whole conceptual confusion, and part of the reason we haven't been able to make good advances, is trying to sort those things out and make sure we're all talking about the same thing.
And what about vocational training? There must be some relationship between job quality and also vocational training, or is that also just seen as a component of job quality?
Skilled workers tend to have better jobs, that's true. And there's all sorts of ways in which labour markets can adjust better if you've got a more educated labour market. Again, that's going to be, I think, very important when we look at what might happen if we have big technological advances in the coming decade or two. But again, that's a generalisation. There are some jobs, low skilled jobs, that are very good quality jobs, and they don't have to go together. And of course, there will always be some low skilled jobs in any labour market. It doesn't mean we have to write those off as low quality jobs, far from it.
Okay. Well, actually turning to the subject of technology and artificial intelligence in the labour market, I remember this book, you probably do as well, Jeremy Rifkin announcing in 1995 The End of Work, with the subtitle The Decline of the Global Labour Force and the Dawn of the Post-Market Era. His view of future labour markets was pretty devastating, again, in that he predicted the end of many jobs, very high unemployment rates. And this was written in 1995, so on the one hand, he's of course been criticised for the fact that this actually didn't come to pass. But on the other hand, also critics have said that the book was written from the perspective of the 70s and 80s, coming out of that slump of low, stagnant productivity growth, etc., and that the book was biased in that sense. So before we go into the specifics of the issue of the future of work, I think my first question relates to the fact or the question, are we influenced ourselves now by the impact of the Great Recession and the very high levels of unemployment that many countries have experienced in recent years? And is this generating some sort of a modern version of this kind of a panic, in that we believe that future technology will have a much greater impact than it has the potential, or that it might actually do in practice?
Clearly, it's difficult to think about labour markets today without thinking about the economic crises we had 10 years ago and the way they still have had impact in many countries. Very real impact, caused a huge amount of misery. But on the other hand, both sociologists like Jeremy Rifkin and economists, when they've made these longer-term predictions about the way that technology will influence the world we live in or the labour market, almost always wrong. Like everybody who predicts the future, they're almost always wrong. I mean, Keynes said 100 years ago that his grandchildren would be working 15 hours a week, and of course that hasn't happened. But on the other hand, another, I think, unfair criticism of that end of work, and of course, as you say, that was at a period when we had prolonged high unemployment. Pretty much every month since then, up until the economic crisis 10 years ago, unemployment dropped. So Jeremy Rifkin couldn't have been more wrong. He was wrong in a way that just all the data showed that his predictions were going in the entirely opposite direction. Some people said this is because there's a law in economics, or what the economists would call the lump of labour fallacy, that as technology gets rid of jobs, then those jobs are lost, and that's what causes unemployment. And by calling it a fallacy, clearly there's a very strong claim that that's just not the way things work. And that clearly isn't the way things worked in the Industrial Revolution that created jobs, or the IT revolutions we've seen in the 20th century, which created more jobs. Now, certainly in Europe, we have historically very high levels of female labour market participation, historically low levels of unemployment. So those things haven't, Jeremy Rifkin's type argument hasn't worked in the past. What you can't do, and no historian would claim you should do, is say, therefore, we can be sure that's how the future is going to play out. I think there are things that are going to happen in the next technological revolutions to do with artificial intelligence and robotics, machine learning and so on, that could be very different from all those previous technological advances, so that what we are going to see now is going to be different. And if Jeremy Rifkin had written his book 30 years later, then he would have been proved right, maybe. But we can't predict the future, but we can start to prepare for it. We can start to think about scenarios, and so that when they creep up on us, we're not totally taken by surprise. That's what we should be doing, is I think, preparing scenarios, thinking about what might happen, from what we know now, what would be a useful, a productive outcome, and what's likely to cause misery on a mass scale.
Different or speedier than previous shifts?
When we talk about the Industrial Revolution, or the revolution that we saw in computers in, say, the second half of the 20th century, they were very gradual changes, by and large. That if you map out those changes from, say, the inventions of the internal combustion motor to us using that as a viable mass form of transport, we're talking decades or even a century. When we were talking about the early advances in computing, again, these advances were taking place over decades. There's some, I think, strong, plausible evidence now that particularly once you get machines that teach themselves, then they can make huge advances in their ability to understand complex situations, not in decades, but actually in hours sometimes. And that, to me, is a huge change. And so, whereas before we have been able to adapt to these changes, they've caused some crises in labour markets. People had to be redeployed. Some occupations dramatically reduced, and people had to be redeployed, away from agriculture or away from manufacturing. But they took place slowly enough, usually, for economies, labour markets to be able to adjust. I think maybe these changes are going to be at such a speed that adjustment isn't going to be an option, not without catastrophes along the way.
And it sounds as though there are two different types of technology at play here. One would be the probably more sort of traditional type of robotics that replace human action, so the robot in the factory, or the robot that delivers your parcels, replaces drivers, driverless cars, etc. But then there's also the whole aspect of artificial intelligence. You were telling me the other day about the chess computer that in a much shorter period of time learned how to beat a human player. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
That's right. Well, if you look at how long it took computers to beat humans and then grandmasters at chess, we were talking about something evolved over decades. But with Go, where a more complex game and a very popular game in China, that set of advances took place in, we're talking weeks really, or actually once they knew how to do it, how to get the computer to analyse games, play against itself, learn from itself, then actually running the computer for hours led to a point where they could beat the best human players. So that gives you an idea of the scale when we look at the chess analogy versus Go. Of course, we don't play, work isn't like playing Go or chess, but I think there are enough similarities to think that, as you say, it's not just robotics, and we've had this idea that, human fingers are limited in all sorts of ways when we're actually making things on a production line, and we've got used to the idea that robots could be nimbler and faster and stronger than humans, and that's something we'll see. But I think that's a very visual thing, that has a big impact, and it's great for science fiction films. But actually the bigger, more pervasive changes are going to be with machine learning, when all sorts of skilled white-collar jobs, and I don't think our jobs are immune from this, will be lots of parts of those jobs, the tasks in those jobs, could be replaced by artificial intelligence. I'm talking about lawyers, accountants, researchers, possibly some of the creative industries even. I mean, some of these things are further away than others. But yeah, it's that way in which this technology is going to affect some occupations more than others, for sure, some countries more than others, but nobody is going to be completely, or very few of us are going to be completely immune from those changes.
So we've got three different dimensions of the problem, really. One is the sheer scale of technological change. The second would be the speed at which it occurs. And then the third, the fact that this artificial intelligence component, that it can actually now do a whole set of different tasks that previously we probably didn't think about. Does that sum up what we think is going to happen?
I think that's, a good summary. Yeah.
So the implication of that, of course, is that you kind of touched on this, is that various different jobs are at risk, whether they're high-end jobs by high-skilled workers, medium quality jobs or low quality jobs. It sounds as though this is going to be disrupted throughout the entire structure of the labour market. Is that something that you would agree with?
I think that's a scenario we have to prepare for. I think it's a very plausible scenario. Whether it happens in that way, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm completely wrong in this, but I think it's plausible. It's something we need to think of as a very distinct possibility. Yeah.
That makes a very interesting sort of situation where, if you think about the labour markets in developing countries, where you have a very large informal sector, for example, of people selling produce in the streets, I would imagine that those jobs would continue despite the disruption of technology, simply because many workers have never really been part of the formal labour market. Whereas in a developed country, if the disruption is to such an extent that people will have to find alternative ways of earning a living, you might end up now with informal sectors of this kind, simply for people to be able to manage and cope with the level of change and loss of income, of course. Yeah,
they could, as you say, could play out very differently depending on levels of economic development. Although some of the projections suggest that actually there's going to be more similarity than difference in the way that countries are affected. They'll be affected differently. Some of the more advanced countries already have automated lots of those jobs which are done by humans in developing countries. So in that ways, the developing countries are more exposed to these changes, but then with slower rates of automation, it'll take longer for those changes to happen. But I don't think there's any country in the world that would say this isn't going to affect us. And what might well happen is some of the jobs which have been done typically in the informal sector will be done by the Amazons of this world, who will take all that into the formal sector and into those multinationals that have been so successful in scooping up lots of those big markets.
It makes for a very complex scenario indeed. So let's say our worst nightmare comes to pass and we lose 50% of the jobs in our labour markets on average, let's say. Yeah. What are the public policies that we should be thinking about? How should we prepare for this scenario?
Right, well I think there's lots of people already been started to think about this, and of course that could mean a massive increase in inequality between those people who are benefiting and working alongside these new technologies and the people excluded from it. And some people's thinking is that we need to somehow protect those people who are excluded so that they aren't, protected from poverty and starvation, and thinking of some really quite dramatic changes to the welfare state system, so that you have universal benefits. Some people will effectively be told, we don't need you anymore, you're not productive, you don't have the skills ever to partake in the new labour market, but we'll look after you. You can stay at home, you can play computer games, you can do whatever you want to in your leisure time. That might solve some of the economic problems if we could think about how to bring about those welfare states. Obviously it would take a lot of thinking by governments and will of governments to do that. But I think that leaves unsolved the other big thing that work brings us, and this is again going back to quality, particularly what good quality jobs bring us, but almost all jobs, apart from the very worst jobs, I think, bring us some benefits in a psychological way. They put structures on our time, they bring us into contact with other people, they give us goals, shared goals with other people, they give us status and identity, and they stop us from just sitting around and ruminating too much. And for all those reasons, social psychologists have shown again and again, it's those psychological aspects of employment, not the economic ones, that protect our psychological well-being. So we don't only think about how to the dramatic redistribution of wealth that these technologies might cause, but it's that redistribution of work. And I think one of the things that we should take seriously is how we could have a world not where half of us continue to work as we do at the moment and the other half are excluded from the world of paid work, but a world where the normal working time is dramatically reduced so that we're working possibly half of what we work at the moment, 2 or 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week, for instance.
So this is, of course, what your current research focuses on. Perhaps if you tell us a little about what you found in terms of not just this relationship between the quality of jobs and well-being itself, but how much do you actually need to work in order to be able to get those benefits from a job that you just mentioned, the psychological benefits, the feeling part of a pack?
That's absolutely the question, as you say, that I'm trying to think about. And we've got 2 different strands of to try and solve this problem, find out how much work you need. And if we can generalise, if it's different for different people, different for different types of jobs. One of the things we're doing is looking at people who already work short hours by choice. Maybe they're people who are fortunate enough to be wealthy and have decided they just want to do less of work. Maybe it's because they have a leisure pursuit. They really want to, they're climbers. They want to be out climbing all the time, not working. Or they're politically very active or active in the local church or in a charity. And we're trying to find people like this to interview. Our initial findings suggest, and looking at other people who looked at similar people, it's actually quite a difficult thing to do, to take yourself out of the normal routine of other people because you lack synchronization with the rest of society. Not only financially, you're not earning the same amount, you can't compete in the same housing markets, for instance, and but also your leisure time is, then you've got leisure time when other people don't have leisure time. So what we're trying to find is whole communities that already work short hours. And that's a challenge, and we're at the beginning of that process. But very interesting, so we're deliberately looking for unusual people. And if anybody watching this interview knows but somebody in that situation that I ought to be interviewing, then definitely. The other way we're looking at it is we've already got some high quality longitudinal studies that measure people's working hours and their well-being. And we can look for the same person, as their working hours vary from year to year and their well-being varies from year to year, what is the relationship and what is the minimum amount of work that you need to get those benefits. So you've got psychological well-being more similar to an employee than to somebody who's not working at all because they're unemployed or have taken early retirement or whatever. And our initial findings suggest that that figure is much lower than even I had suggested it might be. It seems to be that if you work 8 hours a week,
1 day,
it would be equivalent, 1 full day, 2 half days, a couple of hours each day, whatever. That gives you all the psychological benefits of employment. Of course, it doesn't give you the high income you might need to, phones and cars that the rest of us expect in developing societies. But psychologically, that's enough. Because the other thing, of course, and you talk about it as a nightmare scenario, and that's one way, a very good way of looking at it. But you could see this is a fantastic opportunity to think about what societies we want, and a society maybe less focused on paid employment, and a society where we have more freedom to redefine our goals and how we achieve those goals.
Yes, it would mean taking a lot of the things that we strive for and that we're taught to strive for, and this entire culture of meritocracy would be slightly questioned by this new model if your identity is wrapped up in who you are, how long you work, what you do, etc.
Or you think about leisure differently. I mean, at the moment, for a lot of us, we're so busy and working long hours, and particularly this is the case in Chile, but actually you have so little leisure time. Your leisure time is really just getting ready for work the next day, washing your clothes, looking after your kids for an hour. And if you were working, say, 2 days a week, you'd have a lot more leisure time. You'd have to really think what you wanted to do with that, and maybe some of the things that we strive for in work to achieve goals that we value, we would be thinking of striving for those in our leisure time. So it would completely rethink what we wanted from leisure.
So the interesting part of the equation here, of course, is you could potentially have a very different life to look forward to, with much more leisure time. It seems that we need to actually work much less than we would have initially thought in order to get the benefits that we would expect from work. But on the other hand, of course, is the income equation. So if working less means earning significantly less, then that trade-off could, of course, have an adverse effect on psychological well-being. Has anyone looked at that yet? Or
I think that it's fundamental, and of course, so we've had these discussions about technology before, and people have suggested we might have these changes before, and clearly, I was going to say they haven't happened. They have happened to a small extent. We do work shorter working weeks now than we did 50 or 100 years ago, and again, much more in some countries than others, and clearly countries that have had a will to reduce the working week, either through trade union action, trying to negotiate shorter hours as well as a pay rise each year. There have been changes, but much more gradual than some people have predicted. And partly, but only partly, I think it's to do with the economics of the situation. But then, I mean, think of it another way, that typically, as a generalisation across countries and across time, every year we get about 3% more productive. That is, we could earn 3% more, be 3% richer, and that's what we've been. You know, we have had this standard of living increase because we're better trained, we're more skilled as a workforce, we've got a better capital, and we're better organised in the workplace than we have been historically. And we've taken that 3% productivity bonus in terms of pay rises. If we'd taken that in terms of a reduction in the working week, that 3%, roughly speaking, as I calculate it, every 22 years you could either double your pay, which is what we've been doing, or halve your working time. And if we'd been doing that, then we could achieve, and of course these robots, this machine learning, is going to be a fantastic increase in productivity. And again, but in terms of the economics, where's that bonus going to, is it going to be in the hands of a very small number of multinational companies, which is entirely plausible, but so we need to think about redistribution again, so that we all benefit from that massive increase in productivity, not a very small number of, very wealthy individuals or companies.
Yes, the implications on inequality of this are absolutely huge, in the sense that it's normally the most vulnerable workers who are always hit the hardest by changes, by this process of creative destruction, as economists tend to call it, or by deindustrialization, etc. I think that's probably my biggest concern in this future scenario.
It is. I mean, for instance, we're seeing that phenomenal increases in technologies that allow vehicles to drive themselves. And in a way that 20 years ago people would have thought you were crazy if you were suggesting that within the near future on these crazy roads that we've got, that computers could drive better than humans. Now, I think we all accept that there are still legal challenges and we're still perfecting technology, but already computers can drive cars and lorries better than humans. One of the big employment categories for less skilled, particularly male workers, is driving jobs. And if we're going to lose millions of driving jobs, again, they are the people who are at the bottom of the wages structure and bottom of the skills hierarchies. Yeah, you're right to worry. How are we going to cope with that?
The other category I would worry about is migrants, really, and immigrants who seem to find those jobs in particular, I'm thinking of Uber drivers, for example, an easy entry into the labour force, and that's something that, regardless of whether I'm in a developed or in a developing country, I've found all over the world. If you take an Uber in London, the chances of the Uber driver being British are almost zero, and the same is almost happening here in Chile, where new immigrants are going into those jobs that they're often very overqualified for, but it's an easy entry into the labour market from which they can move on. And it seems as though by losing those jobs, we'd be closing a very important door to our labour markets there.
That's a good point. And as you say, something as wherever in the world I go, I see Uber drivers who have often migrated from, but as you say, but they're not low skilled. Often migrants tend to be high skilled. So if, there's something about that niche in the labour market, the fact that Uber drivers is an expanding thing, there are new opportunities. I think it's those things that have allowed immigrants that niche into the labour market. It's not the fact they're low skilled. So I assume that there'll be other, where there's often dramatic change taking place, that's when new entrants to the labour market are going to find their niche more quickly, and I think we're going to see lots of dramatic changes. So I'm optimistic. On that particular issue, I may be more optimistic than you.
Well, it's an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm torn between looking forward to my future, or perhaps my children's future, but on the other hand, being quite worried about the implications of this on our labour markets, on job quality, and in particular on inequality, especially in developing countries where it always seems that the labour markets are trying to play catch-up with developed countries without ever having reached the standard of living and the level of well-being of a developed country. And so it always seems that developing countries seem to get hit by this. It's kind of like a double whammy, because they didn't get to the standard that developed countries had, and now they're having to deal with all this technological change in addition. It's a very difficult position to be in, and very worrying for public policy. But then, as you point out, there are optimistic notes in all of this, and hopefully we can look forward to a more relaxed future.
I think so. I think there are certainly some jobs are going to improve, and there are some jobs where there are real occupational hazards associated with those jobs. Say nurses. A lot of nurses have to retire early because they get musculoskeletal problems, particularly bad backs, from lifting patients. And lifting patients is inherently hazardous because they've got a habit of moving as you're trying to lift them, unlike lifting an inanimate object. And having robots that would help nurses to lift and carry patients is going to mean that those patients are going to carry on being able to do what they are much better at as humans, being able to relate to people, empathise with them. And so that's an example, I think, of a job where we'll see some great benefits from working alongside these technologies, and I'm sure there's going to be some jobs which are made far worse because of them. But even in developed countries, we're trying to think about what we should be measuring now to see how those impacts take place. People whose lives are going to be controlled not by a male or female boss, but by an algorithm. Yes. And people who are going to be working alongside these machines are going to extend their body and help their body, wearables. And I don't think anybody has really worked out where the quality of employment is going to change. I'm thinking, again, simplistically about the numbers of jobs, but quality, as you know, is absolutely vital.
Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. I hope you've enjoyed our talk.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to Chile.